Hello, and welcome to Self-Publishing Insiders. My name is Mark Leslie Lefebvre. I am the Director of Business Development for Drafted Digital, and I am honored to have in dialogue with me today in the virtual studio, Mr. Jeff
Yay.
Elkins, aka the Dialogue Doctor. Welcome,
Hey,
Jeff.
everybody. Yeah, it's great to
So
be here. Thanks for having me on.
now we had you on the show early on in the show's release. I think it was way back when, but
Yeah.
I think it's really critical for us to understand the value of dialogue, and we're going to get into that first. But before we get into that, what I really want to do is I want to find out what you've been up to as a writer lately. What's going on?
Well, I just published my 9th novel, 14th book. I've got a couple short story collections and stuff out, but I have it here next to me. I always have a copy next to me.
Oh, awesome! Hold that
Yeah,
up a little bit
it's
longer.
on sale today for 99 cents.
Ooh,
Um,
that's
yeah,
exciting.
so you can go grab it. And it was a tough one to write. You know, it's a exploration, a like fictional exploration of the issues surrounding the American church. So I wrote it
Okay,
for all of us who like grew up in the American church and kind of feel like something is wrong, like something feels broken. And
right.
so it was just kind of my exploration of that through multiple character journeys. So I published
Awesome.
that in May, and it's on sale today for
Is
99
it just
cents. If
today?
you go
Just
get it,
September 1st as we're
it's on
or
sale until Wednesday of next week. So
all
you've
right,
got till
all right.
what, September 8th, I think that is,
September. Oh my God, I didn't
or
change
7th.
my calendar. Hang on, let me pause in the middle of a live show while I switch the calendar. Oh
Nice.
yeah, September
Hey, well done.
7th is yeah.
Yeah, it's
There we
September
go.
7th.
All
Yeah,
right.
so
So
it's
if
on
you're
sale.
watching
So you can
this
go grab
live,
that.
you benefit from that. But if you're listening to this in the audio feed later, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
You may have missed this.
it's over. Yeah. But so I'm in one of those seasons. I don't know about you, but when I write, I get a book out, and then I need like a month and a half to recover. Like, because it's such
Really?
like for me, it's like such an emotional thing, especially a book that's like super personal like that. Like, um, popping a book out like that. And it's the longest book I've ever written. It's
Yeah, it looks
160K.
really thick. How
Yeah,
much?
it's 160K.
Oh my goodness.
It's a big journey. So
Wow.
it was I've been told it reads very fast, which is good.
Oh, that is
But
really, really good. Yeah, it reads
yeah,
like it's 80K.
it does. I mean, going back to dialogue, it's like 95% dialogue, 90%
Oh,
dialogue.
yeah, so
So
that's fascinating because one of the most valuable things about dialogue that I learned from you is that it really moves the plot forward. But you had a really great analogy involving skeletons and
yeah, so if you think about dialogue is that I've started, since I used that analogy, Mark, it's interesting. I've expanded it a little bit.
really.
So yeah, I find that there's two types of writing now. As I've like worked with authors and so I started the Dialogue Doctor a little over 2 years ago. Since then I've edited over 200 authors and done some really great like study and learning on what dialogue is and um how it works in a book and what it does to the reader, because that's really the question around all of our writing. Like, when we use these tools that we have, tools like dialogue, tools like prose, tools like punctuation, all that kind of stuff, the question is like, what kind of journey are we taking the reader on? Like, what does this tool do for our story in the way that it impacts the reader's emotional journey through our story? So there's kind of two types of writing. There's dialogue and prose. Um, Dialogue is like the skeleton of your book, right? Like, you have to have it. It's the bones. It's what makes the story go. And we can talk about in a second what dialogue is, but it's that like it's and then everything else that hangs on the dialogue is the kind of the meat of the story. So, but without the dialogue, you just have like a lump of goo on the floor. Like, you got to have that foundation. But when we talk about the difference between dialogue and prose, prose is descriptions, especially if they're in paragraph form, or summaries where you're like talking about what's happening, talking about how somebody's feeling, talking about some kind of theme, like, ruminating on some kind of theme with the reader, doing world building in paragraph form where you're like writing about the world you're in. All of that kind of falls under prose. And then the other side of that is dialogue, which is the interaction between characters. And so dialogue gets us is that like well, dialogue means conversation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be verbal. When we talk about dialogue, we're talking about the interplay between characters in a scene. So if you think about the difference, this illustration was super helpful for me to understand the two differences between them. It kind of clicked them in my head when it happened. So I was taking my daughter to New York recently, and we were going across this bridge into Manhattan, and we could see from where we were on the bridge, we could see the whole skyline of Manhattan laid out in front of us. Like the whole thing was right there. And it was it's beautiful, it's awe-inspiring, it's overwhelming, and like look at this enormous like creation that humanity has put together over centuries. Like it's just this giant thing. And it has this experience of backing you up and taking it all in at once, right? That's what prose does. When you have world building, when you have descriptive paragraphs, when you have the character ruminating about what's going on, all those kind of like paragraph chunks that you put in your book, that's prose. And it's like taking in the entire skyline of Manhattan at one time. We drove in, we parked, we got out, and now we're walking around the streets, and that is an incredibly different feeling, right? Walking around the streets, you can hear the noise of the crowd. You can smell all the smells of the city. You can hear the traffic going by, and everything is alive, right? Like there's texture to everything.
Right.
You can touch things, you can feel things. Your five senses are super active. So that's what dialogue is for a reader. So that reflective, the prose has that like reflective move. Dialogue has that moment where you get into the midst of the scene and all five of a reader's senses are imaginatively activated as they experience the scene. Readers want that active imagination, right? So the more you can pull your book into dialogue, the faster it's going to read, the more energies there's going to feel, the more prose you have in your book, the heavier the book is going to get, right?
Right.
Like the bigger and the more trudging it's going to feel, right? Like
Right.
and I've found as I've talked to modern readers and writers, we tend to start skimming prose after about 3 paragraphs. If we
Yeah.
get 3 paragraphs, we start looking forward like, I wonder how much longer this is going to go, right?
Right.
because we've been trained to consume story in a video format, right?
Right.
Like for the last 30, 40 years, that's how we've been taking in story.
Right.
Video format has very little of that reflective storytelling,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
now that gives us an advantage as a writer because we can have a moment with the reader that video can't have, right?
Right.
Where we connect with them on this like thematic and passionate way where we take in the skyline. We just got to be careful to use it strategically, because if we're using that tool all the time, the reader stops feeling like they're a part of the story and they start kind of looking around. Like, okay, I
Right.
took in the skyline. Like, now what do I do? So it's that we got to keep it in the dialogue. Um, so we coach people at Dialogue Doctor to write a dialogue centric scene, which means starting your scene with just the dialogue and then
Right.
building your scene out from there. And then
Yeah.
we train like, hey, let's learn to put our prose in what we call the segments. So if your dialogue is topical, right, like the characters are on a topic, at the beginning and end of a topic is your segment, right? Like your segment is that conversation. You have opportunities to stick that like prose at the beginning and end in a way that doesn't interrupt the energy you're creating with the dialogue. So being strategic like that and be like, okay, the reader's going to experience this scene. They're going to be in the scene on the streets of Manhattan in New York. And then as the topic, as the theme, as whatever's happening in the scene starts to take a breath or like take a pause, we can then jump back and take in the skyline for a couple paragraphs and then get back into the scene. Um, modern like I find that modern writers that we love are really, really great about this. And a lot of them just do it naturally. I think what it comes from is this deep desire to stay in the moment, right? Like, you got to back up, you're going to have to do some world building, you're going to have to do this stuff, but being in the moment as much as you can is what a reader craves and longs for. So the more we can use that dialogue to keep us in the moment, the better.
I love that. I love that as well. I want to just pop up this comment from Maddie in the comments who said, "Love the
Hey, Maddie.
analogy of the New York City skyline versus the streets." And I like that. I was thinking as well. It almost feels like when you're painting a picture and maybe not necessarily using different brushes, but you're using different colors, and you're
Hmm.
using different textures, different colors, different brushes in order to create a dynamic an exciting image or
Hmm.
picture rather than just one big giant broad stroke or
Yeah.
only little, right? Like you're changing it up to keep
Yeah.
to keep the reader engaged in a way, I think.
Yeah, and I think the painting illustration works for those who are artists because, as an artist, when you're painting, you really do have to focus in on those details of every brush stroke, of every pencil stroke, and get into that, like, okay, this piece of hair is going to do this on this portrait.
Right.
You can't just like take a big thick brush and wipe a color across the canvas. I mean, you can, but it's a different experience. And in that
Right.
same
Yeah.
way, like prose is taking that kind of big, heavy brush and just dropping big streaks across the canvas, whereas writing character centric scenes that are dialogue driven is getting into the details and creating that very detailed portrait for the reader to take in. Now,
Right.
will the reader know the difference? Right? Will the reader be like, "Oh my gosh, there's too much prose and he's interrupting his dialogue segments and he's bringing up." No, what the reader's going to say is like, "Man, that book was a lot." Right? If your prose is too much, the reader's going to be like, "Man, that book was a lot." Or the reader's going to be like, "Yeah, I just couldn't get into it." Right? Like on the other hand, like if you're writing really solid dialogue, I was talking to a group of authors yesterday who just read a book that is like a fantastic kind of wonderful dialogue, keeps you very deep in the scene. And one of the authors was like, "I didn't even care what the plot was. I was having so much fun with the characters." And that's what we want, right? Like, yes, we want to have this great plot, but we want to have the reader into the characters.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking a lot when you're talking about the value of dialogue. I'm thinking when you think of a screenplay is mostly dialogue. There's
Mhm.
very little stage direction, right? There's a lot dependent upon the director and the actors, etc. But it's really dialogue intense. And I've been rewatching The West Wing lately, and part of what I'm doing, not just enjoying it, but I mean, politics doesn't interest me, and yet
Mhm.
Aaron Sorkin's scripts and the writers who worked on the show. It, there's such a reveal of relationships between characters in their dialogue and how they
Mhm.
interact with one another. And obviously, there's a lot of walking and talking because you don't want them just sitting at desks. But do you leverage screenplay like scripts and things only because to help people understand? Like, not everyone's read the book, but they
Yeah,
maybe have seen the movie.
I
Or
do I do look at a lot of screenplays and have really focused on Sorkin because he's known for that kind of like energy building dialogue. So, the question, like one of the questions I've looked at screenplays is like, what is dialogue that feels too much, feels too heavy, feels too like weighty, and what is it that like creates energy in dialogue? So, one of the things Sorkin does is he keeps his utterances. So like if you think about dialogue as exchanges, right? Like character A says something, character B says something. That's an exchange, right? And I call it an exchange because what happens when character A speaks and then character B speaks, or and dialogue doesn't have to be vocal, right? Like it can be body language as well. But what happens in that exchange is they're exchanging expectations, like, hey, here's what I expect is happening in the moment that we're having this connection. And they're exchanging emotional resonance, right? Like, this is what I'm feeling. This is what I'm feeling. Like, that's what we do in this exchange that we're having. It's like, oh, these are my expectations of how this conversation is going and what's going on. And these are my expectations of like resonance and like the emotions that we're exchanging back and forth. Um, Inside that exchange is an utterance, right? Like, so A has an utterance, B has an utterance, that makes up an exchange. What Sorkin does is he keeps his utterances incredibly short. And characters actually interrupt each other and cut each other off all the time, but the short utterances build that energy popping back and forth. It works in a novel as well, where your characters' utterances are short, But the other thing he does is he has very clear character voices. And that's what you're talking about, is like the characters are revealed in the conversation. The character voice stems from a character's personality. And the voice is the vocal and physical representation from that character's personality. We call it the dialogue daisy, just as like a teaching illustration, where like the stem of the daisy is the personality, and it blossoms into this voice, which is what the reader actually engages with. The voice includes like the words and language the character uses, the character's body language that's specific to the character, the character's cadence, which is like, does this character use like short sentences or long sentences? Does he speak with a lot of commas? Does he speak with like 2 to 3 sentences at once, or is he just like, more closed off than that? And then the pacing, which is how does the character speak in relation to other characters? So
Right.
if you look at Sorkin's characters, because he writes in this place where everybody is high professional and high energy, all of his characters have very short cadences, except the president, by the way. But all of the other characters have these short cadences. So you get like Josh Lyman and the Rob Lowe character walking down a hallway, and they're just like pop, 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 pop. And you start to get that like energy building from their dialogue. You
Right.
can use that same tool in your books by keeping those cadences short. The dialogue will really start to move quickly. And the
Right.
reader will just like fly through a page. And that has an impact on the reader's experience, right? It makes the reader feel like things are moving. Again, these are all just tools we can use to manipulate the reader's experience with our story.
Right. Right. I love that. Thank you so much. It's yeah. It
Yeah,
was just
Mark, I
one of
feel like you ask a question and I'm like, okay, I'm going to start here and then I'll be over here in like
no, no,
2
no. That was
seconds. So yeah.
no, that was perfect. The other thing I was thinking, I was remembering when I was young. I think I was 6 years old when Star Wars came out, and it was adventure, action adventure in space, right? And then I realized I like science fiction, or science fiction, if you want to use that in quotes, science
Yeah.
adventure, space adventure.
Yeah.
And then I think when I saw my first episode of Star Trek, I realized that was it was all they're just sitting on the starship talking. For the most part, there was very
Yeah.
little action except when
Yeah.
Kirk would fight the whatever. But it
Yeah.
was very very dialogue heavy, and it was a different kind of more let's say like intellectual science fiction. But when I look at it now, it seems like there's a lot more action than I remember when I was a kid. Because when I was a kid, it was all visual. Now as an adult, it was like the interaction and the dialogue between the characters and stuff like that. Is that do you use television show other television show examples like that to
It's interesting that you say that, because I think a lot of times we assume that like if you're watching an action movie or if you're reading an action novel, then action replaces dialogue. It does in some ways, in that like there's a back and forth between characters in an action scene. But if you watch, like, let's take like the Avengers movie, which is like a supreme action movie.
right?
Listen to what's happening in that action scene. They
Right.
talk all the way through it.
That's true. They do.
They
Yeah.
they are because the way we express our emotional state is through that verbal communication with one another. So they inherently know that in writing like this like movie that's going to make billions of dollars, in like an Avengers movie, that they can't have a silent fight scene. They have
Right.
to be talking through it the whole way,
Yeah.
because we as people interpret emotions through verbal expression or through body language and physical expression, right? Like, but
Okay.
that's so even when you're writing, when I coach writers to write a fight scene, I'm like, hey, let's write it as we would a screenplay, and let's get this what they're saying first, and then come back and put the action around it, because
Okay.
the dialogue is the skeleton, and you can build the meat around
Okay.
it, but you got to get that skeleton down. Same thing with a romance, right? Like if you're writing a sex scene, write the dialogue first and then
Really.
put the movements of the characters around it, because it's in that even if the dialogue is just a moan or just a couple words, whatever it is,
Right.
get that dialogue in first. It's going to help you, in addition to keeping the scene engaging and keeping the emotions strong, it's going to help you pace out your emotions.
Right. Right.
because it forces you to think like, okay, what's this character feeling at this second in the scene, and how do I express that emotively?
Okay. When you mentioned the Avengers, I was thinking the reveal of a character, and I'm going back to the comic books, but it also is true in the movies. Spider-Man mocks and does a lot of things with there's engagement. I mean, Deadpool takes it to the whole next level. But the first character I remember doing that was Spider-Man. But it was also a reveal because this was a teenager who was very self-conscious. He was a nerd, and he puts on the mask. He hides behind the mask, but he also hides behind the snarkiness because he's so scared.
Mm.
That's kind of a reveal of his nervousness, that he uses this to throw his enemies and
Yeah, to like
to
protect himself from that. And
yeah.
yeah, so as a writer, if you want to replicate that, so what I would say you're describing, Mark, is a very strong and clear character voice, right?
Right.
Like the writers of Spider-Man knew like this is how he sounds,
Yeah.
which is super important because we relate to him through how he sounds, right? Like, so if you want to like, and but then they have like Captain America who sounds completely different, right? Like,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's because their character voices are different. So it's like you're saying, like Spider-Man, in the words and language he uses, he's going to use a lot of jokes, often to defer attention away from himself, and to keep things light. He gets very uncomfortable when things get heavy, so he uses words that are teenage level, right? Like we don't see him talking about, you know, the problem of government bureaucracy, right? Like he's using like what a
Right.
teenager would talk about. So that's like the words and language he selects. His body language is very teenagery. A lot of times in scenes, you see him with like his hands in his pockets and slouching, or you see him like, leaning against something, right? Like he's very like loose with his body language. His cadence, he talks a lot, especially when he's nervous, which we call a voice modulation. So
Yeah.
like he pours out words, right? Like he's just always talking. The Tom Holland version of Spider-Man does that really well, right? Like there's
Yeah.
just constant chatter happening. And then the pacing, he likes to be engaged in conversation. So he's constantly jumping in to conversations, even if he doesn't belong. He's constantly like putting his 2 cents in. Whereas if you flip that character voice, you look like a Captain America character voice, which is the more like stoic, commanding character voice. He doesn't ask any questions. So, like, the language he chooses is very declaratory. He's making statements about
Right.
how he feels. He's not afraid or doesn't hesitate to ever express his direct feelings on something. So, he just says things, floats ideas out there, and then waits for everybody to respond to them. His body language, he's always standing straight. His shoulders are always back. His movements are very commanding, right? Like, so he points at things a lot, and he like, when he doesn't fiddle with things, right? Like fidgeting with things is a nervous habit for a nervous character.
Yeah.
Captain America doesn't fidget, right? Like he's
Right.
still and he's focused and he's big on the page. And then when you get to his cadence, he uses like 1 to 2 sentences at a time. He doesn't have the verbal diarrhea of Spider-Man, right? Like he's very
Yeah.
like 1 or 2 things. He says what he means to say, and then he doesn't talk anymore. And then
Right.
you get to his pacing, he listens a lot more than he speaks. So like when you're writing a Captain America type character, know that they're going to be early in the conversation. So in your segment where all the characters are going back and forth in these exchanges, you're going to get a lot of Spider-Man in that segment. You're just going to get a little bit of Captain America because he's
Right.
only going to enter the conversation when he absolutely has something to say, and he's not afraid to let everybody else talk because he is this commanding presence, right? Like,
Yeah.
so you can see how like separating out these character voices and making the character voices very different creates this texture in which we as a writer can start to play with the conflict between characters, the emotional engagement between characters. And if we throw one more thing in there, which you mentioned, which is voice modulation. So we have kind of our baseline voice, which is like what we sound like most of the time.
Yeah.
I just described like here's what Spider-Man and Captain America sound like most of the time. In moments of tragedy, right? Like Spider-Man's voice modulates, jokes stop, right? Like verbal diarrhea stops. He actually struggles to put together full sentences in that moment, right? Like, so you get
Right.
these like deep moments of pain, and it's the modulating of the voice and the changing of the body language that communicates that emotional change that pulls the story consumer in. So in the
Right.
same way we can do that in our books by being conscious of like, okay, we're going to modulate this voice in this climactic moment of pain. So the commanding character suddenly questions,
Right.
right? The fun loving, uh, self-conscious teenager is suddenly broken, right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
but you don't say to the reader on the page, and now Spider-Man is broken. You modulate his
Yeah.
voice in the conversation. And when you
Right.
modulate his voice in the conversation, our brains are attuned because we talk to people all the time. Because all we're doing when we write is we're replicating what people see in the world, right? Like, so we're constantly interacting with people, and the way that we communicate emotions on a daily basis is through our body language and the modulation of our voice. So you don't have to tell a reader this character is sad. You can show a reader this character is sad by modulating the character voice. But what that demands up front is that you understand the character voice before you modulate it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm curious for your perspective of dialogue tags, and what are some of the mistakes that authors make with dialogue tags? He
Mm,
asked.
that's great. Yeah, he asked. He asked hesitantly. Yeah, no. So I think we forget. I think we have this love-hate relationship with dialogue tags where we're like, they feel like they could be valuable, but we're terrified of them. So we just try to either like only use them when we absolutely have to, or like I've heard people be like, completely leave them out, never use them. And that's like saying, I feel like that's like looking at a carpenter who's putting up cabinets and being like, hey, that screwdriver is tough to use, so never use it. It's like, well, what if I got to screw something in? Like you got to use it. So it's that, but that's how dialogue tags are. They're just so first, like, let's remove the fear. They're just a tool. That's
Okay.
all they are. They do three different things. The first thing dialogue tags do is they identify who's speaking. So
Right.
if you're in a two-person conversation, what I call a one-on-one conversation, you don't need them as much. We know who's talking. Your paragraph spacing is doing that work for us, right? Unless you're Jose Saramago and you don't use any paragraph spacing or dialogue tags, and then but the paragraph spacing does that for us, right? Like we know who's speaking, so we don't necessarily need dialogue tags for that first thing. But if you're in a 3, 4, 5 person conversation, which I call a big cast conversation,
Right.
you got to use those dialogue tags because otherwise the reader is going to be super confused as to who's talking, or you're going to weigh your conversation down with a massive amount of body language. Everybody's going to move before they speak, and it's just the conversation all of a sudden feels like very weighty. You lose that
Right.
Aaron Sorkin pop in there, right? Like because
Right. Right.
characters can't just talk. So you got to be using dialogue tags in those bigger things. The second reason you use them is to generate pacing, right?
Okay.
So if my character's expression is like, I think that we should go to the movies tonight to see that really great show. Aaron said, I think we should go to the movies tonight to see that really great show. You can see how putting the dialogue tag up front slowed the pace down. So
Right.
you can use that tool in order to create a thoughtful moment, right? Like Aaron rubbed his chin and looked up in the sky
Okay.
and said, I think, and you can see that and said creates a little more
Right.
space, makes it a little more thoughtful. You can also put it in the middle of the utterance in order to create breaks or breaths in the utterance to break it up. I think Aaron said that we should go to the movie to see that really great show. You can see that I'm emphasizing different parts of the utterance.
Right.
And by
Right.
dropping that tag in there, it creates a different imaginative feel, right? Like, or if you want to keep it fast, you put it at the end. I think we should go to the movies to see that really great show, Aaron said. That like keeps it out of the way and is like a throw off. So
Right.
in addition to like identifying who's speaking, dialogue tags can also be used as a tool to shape the pacing of a character's utterance. The third
Okay.
thing they can do is to emphasize emotion, right? Like, so I think the best, if you want to look at an author that does this in an amazing way, Toni Morrison uses dialogue tags to really like bring out emotion. So, rarely does Morrison use she said. She uses a lot of like she shouted, she cried, she, in a release of agony, she yelled like, and so using dialogue tags to emphasize the emotion that the character's experiencing is that third tool we can use for them. Can you use a tool too much? Well, yeah, sure. If you're building a house and the only tool you're going to use is a hammer, so you're just walking around banging on all the walls, like it's not like you're gonna have you're gonna have a very holy house. But if you're, so you got to use tools strategically. But the key is to like know what the tool does. This is what
Right.
dialogue tags do. They identify who's speaking, they create pacing in the utterance, and they enhance the emotional expression of the utterance. Or like know what they do, and now you can use it strategically. You can pick that hammer up when you get a knock at a nail. Right. Like so.
Right.
And I think
Okay.
all of our tools are that way as we write. Like the key is to understand like what does this tool do to the reader's experience.
Right.
And once we get what the tool does, we can then start playing with them.
And I guess related to the dialogue tags are those descriptors for the dialogue, like,
Mhm.
he said angrily and stuff like that. I mean,
Yeah.
those are places where you may use those sparingly as well, or you may inject that into the words and maybe that pacing of the way that they're spoken, right?
Yeah. And there's no rules, right? Like it's all just whatever you want to do with it, right? Like this is an art form in the end. So there aren't any rules of like the right and wrong way to do it.
Right.
There's just burden you place on the reader. So
Right.
like, I mentioned Jose Saramago a second ago. I read his book Blindness. It's one of my favorite books of all time. It terrified me. It's so scary. I walked around for weeks thinking I was going to go white blind all of a sudden and be thrown in an asylum. He uses no punctuation. That's a
Right.
tool that he chose not to use.
Right.
It created a burden on me as a reader because I had to be like, oh, this tool I expect to be there is being denied to me.
Right.
Right. Like, so now I have to read it without that tool.
Right.
And that's, it's the experience he wanted to create for me. And I ended up loving it. Right. Like it was great.
Interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Or, Cormac McCarthy's On the Road never names his main characters.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's a tool, and he doesn't give them a lot of backstory.
Yeah.
Those are both tools that do something for us, right? Like giving a character a name creates a relation between us and the character because when we name something, it's important. And
Right. Right.
giving backstory allows us to connect a little bit more to the character's personality because we come to understand who they were and what they went through to get to this place. By refusing to use those tools, he creates an experience that keeps us solely in the moment and focused on right now and forces us to really listen to these characters to understand who they are. Right? Like he
Right.
denied the reader that tool to
Yeah.
create the reader specific experience. So as you use things like dialogue tags, you can deny the reader tools in order to force an experience, or you can play with tools. Like maybe you give one character their voice is super expressive, so they always have that like adverb or adjective attached to their dialogue tag, whereas the other characters don't. Right? Like
Right.
it's a tool you can use to set this character out. Right? Like, or maybe you define like this character never speaks in a joyful way. This character always speaks in a joyful, expressive way. So you're going to use those dialogue tags to demonstrate that. If you have a
Right.
thoughtful character, like maybe you just put that dialogue tag always at the front before that character speaks to create that little micro speed bump before the reader gets into that character's voice. So, but again, it's like strategically using these tools to play with what you're doing.
Right. I
Yeah.
love that. Cool. Thank you. I'm going to start to take some questions from the live viewers. So
Yeah, go for it.
first questions from Lexi. And you kind of talked about this a little bit, but the question specifically is how do you avoid making scenes that are too dialogue heavy? Writing romance, I feel like it can be easy to accidentally create a scene that's almost all dialogue, minimal prose. So, yeah, how do you identify or avoid making
Don't avoid it. Go for it all the way in. No,
Really?
yeah, I'm
Okay.
just, I'm kidding. So there is a problem in that when you're writing very heavy dialogue, the reader loses spatial recognition, right? Like,
Like, where are they?
like where
Yeah.
are the
Yeah.
characters in the
Okay.
space that they're in, and
Okay.
how are they physically in comparison to each other? Because a sentence said when two characters are centimeters away from each other is very different than a sentence said when two characters are across the room from each other, right? Like
Right.
that
Right.
sentence feels different for the readers. So what I tell a writer is like, hey, think about dialogue, think about your scene, right? The segment that we talked about. Think about that as like happening on the stage of the reader's mind.
Right.
You need a couple things. We need to know what characters are in that scene, right? Like readers don't like to be surprised. You go like a whole page, and then all of a sudden you're like, Dolly said, and you're like, where did Dolly come from? Like readers don't like that. They want to know who's in the room with them when they're in the
Right,
room.
right,
They want to know generally what kind of room is this. We don't need like you might if it's part of your voice, you might write a ton of scenery. If it's not, I'm very bad at scenery, so I don't write very much scenery, but you still need to orient the reader into like where are we, and then as people move around the room and as they walk around the room, we need to know where they're going because the proximity to other characters and how they're behaving in the room is all part of their body language, and it
right,
paints that scene on the mind. The other thing you have to know when you come into the scene is the emotional tone, which is conveyed through the dialogue but can also be
right.
conveyed through how you're describing things around the characters.
Okay.
So like I tell readers like, hey, I tell writers like, hey, if you can get those things in, right? Like if when you read your scene, you're like, okay, I know who's here. I know where we are, at least on a general way. And I also know like this is the emotional feeling that I'm going for, then your scene should be good. When people say the dialogue is too heavy, often it's like, I don't know how to orient myself in this space. And characters are appearing all the time. And I don't
Right.
know where they came from. Right. Like, so
Yeah.
it's that like making sure you have your core components.
Right.
But if you have your core components, you're good to go. I would say the other thing, it may be that your book is, and this is something I'm very guilty of. My books tend to be very fast paced. Like I said, the novel that I just wrote, Inside Outside, it's like 90% dialogue because
Right.
that's what I enjoy. That's what I
Yeah.
do. I did have readers come to me, and I had my beta readers came to me. At first, it was like 98% dialogue, and my beta readers came to me and they're like, "You have to give your protagonist inner thoughts because he's such a closed off character.
Right.
We're not getting his inner life in his interactions with others." So I went
Right.
back and I added inner thoughts. And inner thoughts are that like pull between or like first person POV is a midpoint between that like reflective prose and that like in the scene. You're pulling me out of the scene, but just a little bit. Not
Right.
all the way
Right.
back to look at the skyline of Manhattan. You're just pulling me out of touch so that I can just, I'm still in the streets, but you're like, hey, let's have an aside over here and then go back in. So, inner thoughts, if you use too many of them, they can really feel like we're pulling out into that
Right.
skyline setting. But the key is to what I tell writers is if you start including inner thoughts, think of them as a third character in the scene.
Inner thoughts is a third character in a scene.
Yeah, because it's really a character who's having an aside with the reader all the time.
Right. Right. Okay. Yeah. Talking to
So
yourself.
yeah,
Yeah.
so treat them like a character. Treat their voice in the segment like a
Oh, I like
character,
that.
where you're
Okay.
trying to like balance out the character voices. Everybody gets turns to speak. We don't want to lose any characters. We don't want to lose our inner thoughts, right? Like if you have a whole segment, if you're writing a book in first person POV and your character has a lot of inner thoughts, and all of a sudden you have a full segment of dialogue and there's no inner thoughts in there, the reader's going to be like, what did they stop thinking? Like, where did they go? Like,
Oh, yeah.
we got to keep that character in. At the same time, if it's just inner thought after inner thought after inner thought after inner thought, just know that like, man, that third character, they're really loud. They're taking up a lot of space in
Yeah.
the conversation.
Well,
Yeah,
that's part of their character, right? They're just they're
it can be right.
they're
Like
just
again, there's no
aggressive. Yeah.
rules. It's just a tool,
Right.
but you got to know what your tool's doing to
So,
everybody.
I wanted to ask you about monologue, and I wanted to ask you what monologue with respect. This is a per, purely selfish
Oh
question
yeah,
because
go for it.
I have a series that is written first person perspective, a very thoughtful, uh, navel gazing kind of main character, and that is his character. So there's a lot of long, and they're like monologues to the reader.
Hmm.
I like to see them as monologues to the reader as opposed to exposition. But I know that's a challenge that I get into. But he is having conversation with himself a lot because he spends a lot of time in his own head as a loner. So question about monologue in that inner dialogue and monologue when a character, and I don't know, I know there's the issue of so tell us professor where
Yeah, no,
there's like
no.
now I'm going to explain the entire universe to you in my paragraph of speech.
No, yeah. So let's break down monologue and what it is. There's monologue in the context of a conversation where, like,
Yeah.
you know, TJ Klune does this really beautifully in his book, The House on the Cerulean Sea, where his character Linus is constantly having. And now he's not first person POV, he's third person close, but you hear Linus's voice all the time. And
Right.
like what's great about the character is that his inner voice is usually the opposite of what comes outside, so it's really necessary because what he's
Yeah.
thinking is like you got to have it in there. He treats that inner voice when you're in the context of a conversation or when you're in the context of a scene. He treats that inner voice like it's a third character.
Oh, I love that.
And then there's that other form of monologue that you're talking about where it's first person POV, and I'm going to back up and I'm going to talk about, what's happening in the world, right? Like Dresden books do this a lot. Like Jim Butcher's constantly like backing up and giving us like a page of Dresden, just like,
Right.
pontificating on how much his life sucks. The
Yeah.
key is to focus it on the now.
Okay.
Right, like because that's what the reader wants to be in the story.
Right.
So don't get theme heavy with it. Keep as much of your world building out of it as you can.
Okay.
You don't want your character giving paragraphs of explanation about how the world works. Show us how the world works by like demonstrating how that world works. What this is great for, these monologues are great for though, is to give us the character's opinion on events, actions that are happening, and on how the character feels about different people and about different things. You can also kind of catch us up on backstory with it. So
Right.
I tell writers like, hey, 3 to 5 paragraphs is kind of the sweet spot. If you can get it done in 3 to 5 paragraphs, fantastic.
Right.
Try not to go over 8.
Right.
If you're monologuing in first person POV for 8 paragraphs, the reader starts to go like, when is this going to be done? Like, can I skip to where they're
Yeah.
talking again? Can I skip to where something's actually happening? Right. Like, so it's about using that tool in a strategic way and knowing like, okay, this slows the story down. This
Right.
makes things heavier. It takes longer to read, right? Like
Right.
paragraphs on a page takes us longer to turn that page than the
Mm.
dialogue does. So it makes the reader feel like this is moving slower.
Yeah.
So keeping it like making sure that you're just aware of how much of it you're doing and
Right.
aware that like, okay, this is going to slow the book down some. And again, that's okay. It's just like, how do you want the book to feel? If you
Yeah.
want it to be a roller coaster ride, the less of that you can do, the better. Yeah.
Cool. I love that. Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Because to try not to take mad notes while I'm supposed to be interviewed. um, but I'm excited that you've got a workshop coming up. Now we're recording this on September 1st, 2022, and you've got a workshop coming up. Is it on the 10th of September?
It's September 10th on a Saturday from noon to 4. You can sign
Okay.
up for it at dialoguedoctor.com. In the menu, there is a button that says Masterclass. You can
Okay.
sign up for it there. Um, it's 4 hours. It's from noon to 4. And
Right.
this is our like dialogue 101 workshop. So
Okay.
what we're going to do is we're going to teach you like, hey, here's how to write a dialogue centric scene. And
Dialogue centric scene.
dialogue centric scene so that the
Okay.
dialogue is the center of your scene. So we're going to define all the parts of dialogue. We're going to talk about like because dialogue has 3 parts: vocalization, dialogue, tags, and body language. We're going
Right.
to talk about like the 3 parts of dialogue, what they do. We're going to talk about how dialogue is made up of utterances, exchanges, and segments so that you understand like the components of dialogue. We're then going to teach you how like, okay, knowing what dialogue is and knowing what prose is in contrast, let's write a dialogue centric scene where you're just getting the character utterances out.
Right.
And then we take that dialogue centric scene that we work on and we're like, okay, now let's turn it into a full scene. So we show you how to go from that dialogue centric scene, which feels like a screenplay without all the formatting,
Right.
to going to a full scene that reads like someone would expect a novel scene to read. And then we teach you, like, okay, now that you've written that scene, let's look for segments and places where we can place some prose.
Right.
So the goal is to rebuild how you write so that character voice, the character's experience, becomes the center of what the reader is doing. So
Nice.
you get that like very character focused book as opposed to a book that's heavily plot focused, which are harder to engage readers with. Um,
Awesome.
so, and then after we talk about how to write, we're going to go into how to edit. We're going to talk about how to self edit your dialogue to
Okay.
save yourself time with editors.
Awesome.
We're going to give you like 5 things to look for. We're going to go through each of those 5 things. We're going to talk about like how to recognize reader burden when you're putting too much burden on the reader, how to recognize muddled character voices. so that
Right.
you're like, oh, these characters stop sounding the same here at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the second half. The last 2 hours we talk about editing tricks and how to self-edit and what to look for when you're editing dialogue. The goal is when you walk away from the masterclass, you have a whole new set of tools to
Right.
use in your writing to kind of empower your writing to engage more with the reader.
I love that. Thank you. And
Yeah.
just to remind people who, especially people who are listening to this and not watching the video, you can learn more about Jeff over at dialoguedoctor.com. And that's spelled
Oh,
out doctor, right? Not DR.
yeah, not DR, doctor. And if I could add something real quick about the masterclass, it does cost money, right? It's $249
Right.
to come.
Yeah.
But in order to create equity in the writing community where historically there hasn't been, if you are a person of color, you're free. So you can go to dialoguedoctor.com, click on that masterclass button, and the instructions are in there how to notify us. No questions asked.
Oh, Jeff, that is so
Yeah.
amazing. I love that. I love that. That is fantastic. So dialoguedoctor.com, again, persons of color, there's a way you can register for that and get into that course completely for free. That is amazing. Thank you
Yep.
for doing that.
Yeah, and if you can't attend on the day, we give you you get a recording of it when you register. So if you can't attend on the day, after we record it on September 10th, we'll send you a recording of the whole thing. So if you can't come on September 10th, you still want to do it, you can register and you'll get a recording at the end of it.
Awesome. Jeff, thank you so much. It's always great to learn from you. Dialogue. I'm going to go check out that course, sign up for it myself.
Thanks,
I want to
Mark.
remind viewers and listeners, you can bookmark d2dlive.com. We are here live every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern time or noon Central. You can check out industry insights over at d2d.tip/insight. You can, if you're looking for promotions, go to d2d.tip/d2d promo form. Sign up for promotions for awesome authors. And if you want to join the print beta, you can just log into your account, click on that little print button and ask to join, or go to draftdigital.com/print beta. Lots of great information over at draftdigital.com/blog. And be sure to like, subscribe, all the wonderful things. And Jeff, thanks again so much for hanging out with me today.
It was so much fun. Thanks, Mark.
Okay. And goodbye, everyone.
Bye.